Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, veteran and former active duty JAG, and this is Military Murder, a show where I focus on crimes committed by military members and veterans. Because let's be honest, we all want to be in the know when crimes occur among our community. The last 2 weeks, you have heard my interview with retired Command Sergeant Major Womack, a survivor of the 2003 Camp Pennsylvania attack by one of our very own. Well, today, I am bringing you that case from start to finish. Hopefully, it will help to put everything together in your mind. With that, I want to thank you so much for listening to the show. Please continue to share the show and especially this episode with your friends. And if you feel up to it, make sure you leave a 5-star rating. Additionally, this week only, if you head over to patreon.com/militarymurder, you can listen to this full episode completely ad-free. That's right, no ads. Even if you only sign up for the free tier, you will get absolutely 0 ads. With that, let's get into it. Today, I am telling you the story of Camp Pennsylvania circa 2003. Now, let's dig in.
Military Murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
If you've ever been deployed, you know that if you ever have to wake up in the middle of the night to pee, you head outside of your tent and it is eerily quiet and very dark. Well, that's the setting. It's the dead of night on March 23rd, 2003. We're at Camp Pennsylvania, a forward station base in the Kuwaiti desert, just 25 miles south of the Iraqi border. The U.S. invasion of Iraq is just 3 days old, and the 101st Airborne Division is camped here. They're poised to join the fight. But for right now, they eat in the same chow line, bunk in close quarters, and they share the anticipatory jitters of soldiers who are about to enter combat. Among the tents at Camp Pennsylvania is the sleeping quarters for the leadership. It's a large, sand-colored tent, and this is where the commander, Colonel Frederick Ben Hodges, is sleeping. His senior enlisted advisor, Command Sergeant Major Bart Womack, is up late, as we heard. He's getting ready to fill his magazines with ammunition as he's watching Tiger Woods on TV. And near him in the tent is the executive officer, Major Romaine. Before I delve into the attack itself, I do want to talk about the 2 men at the center of this story, the victims, and their lives were brutally cut short. Captain Christopher Seifert, just 27 years old, was the brigade's assistant S2, and S2 means intelligence, so he was an intelligence officer. He hailed from Easton, Pennsylvania, and Chris Seifert was an Army brat turned Army officer. He joined ROTC in college and earned a history degree before commissioning as an infantry lieutenant. After serving in Germany and even serving during a peacekeeping stint in Kosovo, he switched his career field to military intel, bringing his analytical mind to the 101st Airborne. Colleagues said that Seifert was like a sponge in terms of information. He wore the emotion of loving the Army on his sleeve. He always had a smile on his face. At Camp Pennsylvania, he spent long hours poring over maps and enemy intel, and he was preparing the brigade for war. Despite the stress, though, he remained upbeat and dedicated. He was also a family man. He'd married his college sweetheart, Teresa, and the couple had a 4-month-old baby boy back home. Captain Seifert's future was bright. He was the kind of officer who took care of his soldiers and loved what he did. Major Gregory Stone was 40 years old. He was an Air Force officer attached to the 101st. Major Stone was a member of the Idaho Air National Guard, serving as an air liaison officer with the brigade. His job was to coordinate air support for the Army troops, linking ground forces with the Air Force's firepower. By March of 2003, Greg Stone was a seasoned officer and a beloved leader. He had a fiancée named Tammy waiting for him to come home, and he was a father to 2 young boys. Stone was known as steady under pressure, exactly the kind of officer that you want in a war zone, helping guide close air support. As the 101st prepared to cross into Iraq, Stone would have been the key to calling in airstrikes to protect the troops on the ground. These 2 men, Captain Seifert and Major Stone, were not just names on a roster. They were husbands, fathers, and leaders respected and loved by those who served with them. But on this night, Seifer is likely asleep in the command tent or just nearby, and Stone, he's probably wrapping up some plans or he's also resting after a long day. Neither, however, have any idea what's about to happen. They believe, like everyone else, that if danger exists, it lies beyond the camp's perimeter. Tragically, though, they're wrong. Shortly after 1 a.m., most of Camp Pennsylvania is quiet when suddenly Command Sergeant Major Womack sees an incendiary grenade roll right in front of him in his tent. Both he and Major Ken Romaine lock eyes as they blink in disbelief. Then it's lights out. The generator that powers the camp's floodlights and tents is abruptly shut down. Quote, "I knew we were in the land of not quite right," Womack said, and he was describing how surreal the moment felt. He lunges to wake Colonel Hodges up, who's the brigade commander, and he's fast asleep in the back of the tent. Before Hodges can even fully comprehend what the heck is going on, a grenade detonates with a blinding flash. The command tent is ripped by the blast. Shrapnel tears through Mav's canvas and flesh. In an instant, the air is filled with smoke and the groans of shouts of people wondering what the heck is happening. And just like that, it was pitch black, and the tent was filled with smoke. Womack manages to shove Colonel Hodges towards the tent exit. They plan to make a run for it, but as Womack dashes out ahead, he loses sight of Hodges in the choking smoke. A second grenade goes off, the concussion knocking Hodges right off of his feet and blasting him back inside the tent. In the confusion, Womack hears a gunshot. He knows, as he told us, it's the XO. Major Romaine has been shot. Womack reaches for his sidearm, but like many others on base, he isn't carrying ammunition in the secure camp. He's effectively unarmed in the darkness. Outside the tent, Womack recalls that it's eerily quiet, despite what has just happened inside his tent. And then boom, all of a sudden, more grenades explode in two other tents where soldiers are sleeping. Within seconds, 4 grenades have been thrown into 3 different tents, and it's clearly a coordinated ambush. Remember, the camp is completely dark now, lit only by flames from burning tents and the eerie green of chemical light sticks tossed out for illumination. Panicked soldiers stumble out of their tents in underwear and t-shirts, right? Because they were just sleeping, desperate to find out what the heck is going on, and they're trying to find cover in addition to help their buddies. Then comes another terrifying twist: gunfire. As soldiers pour out of the tents, someone opens up with an M4 rifle, spraying bullets at the silhouettes of men and women trying to flee. Tracer rounds streak through the darkness. The instinctive thought among everyone is, oh my gosh, we're under enemy attack. Perhaps Iraqi special forces infiltrated the camp. Shouts of alarm echo, "Incoming, take cover." In fact, survivors later recalled hearing a voice yell, "We're under attack." And this is all as the chaos began. In another smoke-filled tent, Captain Seifer is trying to escape when a bullet strikes him in the back. He collapses at the tent entrance. All around, soldiers are yelling and they're scrambling. Some think this is a Scud missile attack or some kind of terrorist infiltration. It was kind of an ugly scene, remembered one wounded captain. A lot of noise, a lot of screaming, a lot of blood. 3 tents have now been torn apart by blast. In at least one tent, an incendiary grenade has been set ablaze. Later, Womack would describe finding 3 of the tents were a bloody mess, a ghastly mix of blood, shrapnel, and debris. Amid the destruction, Captain Chris Seifer lay on the ground, grievously wounded. He's been shot through the back. Now, despite frantic efforts by those around him, Captain Seifer bleeds out quickly from the gunshot wound. He is dead within minutes of the attack's start. He never got to fire a single shot. He likely never even saw his killer. Major Greg Stone is pulled from one of the other blasted tents. He's alive, but only barely. His body has been peppered with shrapnel from a grenade. In fact, doctors later counted 83 wounds in Major Stone's body. Imagine that. 83 pieces of hot metal ripping into you. Stone is evacuated in the aftermath, desperately fighting for life. All told, 16 American service members are casualties of this sudden rampage. 2 are fatally wounded: Captain Seifert, who died that night, and Major Stone, who died the following day, and 14 others suffer wounds ranging from minor shrapnel cuts to life-threatening injuries. Colonel Hodges, the brigade commander, survives with an arm wound. He's seen afterward with blood on his uniform and his arm in a sling. Some of the wounded are so badly hurt that they will have to be sent home, unable to continue their mission to Iraq. Some, however, remain in country. Remember, Command Sergeant Major Womack called them the walking wounded. In the immediate moments after the explosions, confusion reigns supreme. Soldiers are yelling orders, there's questions, flying into the darkness. Is the camp under external attack? Could Iraqi commandos or terrorists have literally slipped into the perimeter? Remember, Command Sergeant Major Womack actually told us that he began to wonder if the perimeter security troops had actually fallen asleep on the job, because the idea of an insider, one of their very own, being responsible is so unthinkable that many don't even consider it at first. As one Army spokesman later put it, when someone's firing at you, you know who the enemy is. When they're standing in the chow line with you, it's hard to recognize. The shock of this kind of betrayal dealt a detrimental effect to morale. Soldiers are trained to trust their comrades beside them with their lives. Now, that trust was shattered. Amid the chaos, medics and fellow soldiers race to aid the wounded. They drag bleeding men out of burning tents, and they apply field dressings under the beam of red-lensed flashlights. Others establish security, fearing that this might be part of a larger assault. At first, some imagine perhaps an enemy artillery shelling or some sort of missile strike happened, but it quickly becomes evident these were grenades exploded inside of individual individual tent. But listen, before I continue, let's talk about the British Air Force Tornado that was shot down that night. We heard Command Sergeant Major Womack talk about it last week. I looked up more information about this, and it is reported that the Royal Air Force Tornado GR-4A was mistakenly struck down by a U.S. Patriot missile at 2:48 a.m., which was a little over an hour after the first grenade attack on Camp Pennsylvania. The investigation into that friendly fire incident does not mention the Camp Pennsylvania attack, but I'm going to circle back to this investigation at the end of this episode to close the loop. I did want to mention it here because I remember that Command Sergeant Major Womack and I spoke about it. Okay, so let's get back to accountability at Camp Pennsylvania after the grenade attack. So accountability takes place, and that's when the commander realizes that one soldier is missing. In addition to this soldier being missing, there are unaccounted for grenades missing from the armory. The realization sets in that this was likely an act of sabotage or fragging. That is when a soldier attacks his own unit. Fragging is the Vietnam-era term for soldiers killing their superiors with fragmentation grenades, and it's something almost unheard of in the modern army. As the troops form up in the darkness, one name echoes without answer: Sergeant Hasan Akbar. He's an electrician and mechanic, a combat engineer from Alpha Company 326 Engineer Battalion, and he's attached to the brigade. Akbar is unaccounted for, and in the chaos, nobody had noticed exactly where he was. Now, as the pieces come together, he's the lone soldier unaccounted for. At the same time, someone reports that earlier that night, Akbar had been on guard duty at a weapons storage Humvee, and after he was relieved, a cache of grenades was found missing. Military police recover a crucial clue: fingerprints on the handle of the camp's main generator, which had been tampered with and switched off just moments before the attack. Now, let's put a pin in these fingerprints, but I will mention this now. Much later, those fingerprints would come back as a match to the fingerprints of Sergeant Akbar. Once leadership realizes that Akbar is missing, they begin searching. Command Sergeant Major Womack later described the chilling dilemma. The easy part was realizing, okay, one of our guys is missing. But the hard part is, how do we tell the other 4,000 people on the camp that we're looking for one of our own, wearing the same exact uniform as us? They don't want terrified, angry soldiers accidentally shooting each other in confusion. So Womack and the remaining commanders impose order. They set up guards on ammo depots to prevent anyone else from arming up without permission. They establish a password system at checkpoints so no one triggers a friendly fire incident re-entering a tent, right? Meanwhile, a small team quietly fans out to hunt for Akbar within the perimeter. Now, I want to draw your attention back to what Command Sergeant Major Womack told us. He said that at this point, they're hyper-focused on finding the attacker. And at first, before they realized that Akbar was missing, he suspected the interpreters who had just arrived that day into the camp. He even said that they were apprehended at some point at gunpoint and interrogated, but then they were let go. After a tense hour or so, one search team led by Major Kyle Warren, the Brigade S2 intel officer, and ironically, Captain Seifert's boss, he spots movement near a sandbagged bunker by the edge of camp. The bunker had gone unchecked in the initial chaos. So Major Warren approaches carefully. In the darkness of the tent, Warren smartly holsters his own pistol to avoid a loud confrontation, and he creeps closer as he sees Akbar. Eventually, he is able to detain and take him down. Akbar does not fight, nor does he resist. He seems almost like dazed, but he is carrying his M4 assigned weapon. As Womack later put it, Akbar had no idea that we were looking for him. There's something that turns a person on to do an attack like this, and then there's something that turns them off. He was now in off mode. It's roughly 2 o'clock in the morning when military police formally detain Sergeant Hasan Akbar. Soldiers who moments ago were tending to bleeding friends now are staring face to face with Akbar, and they are stunned. They want to whoop his ass. Some have to be physically held back. The urge to exact immediate revenge on this betrayer is running hot. But the officers and Command Sergeant Major Womack maintain discipline. They need Akbar alive to answer for what he's done. As he's being led away in handcuffs, Akbar reportedly speaks, offering a glimpse of his twisted rationale. To the guards around him, he blurts out that he was worried, quote, American soldiers would be raping and killing Muslim women and children in Iraq, end quote. You see, in his fractured mind, he seems to be claiming that he acted almost like in self-defense of other people. He says, though, little else. To Army investigators who later attempt to interview him, Akbar refuses to cooperate further. The extent of his confession is basically that spontaneous remark, basically saying that he was concerned for other Muslims. So, who is Sergeant Hasan Akbar? Hasan Akbar was not an enemy infiltrator sneaking in from outside the perimeter. He was a U.S. soldier who had been living and training with these very men for months. At 32 years old, Akbar, who was born Mark Fidel Cools, was a sergeant and a combat engineer in the division. Akbar's story begins in the inner city of Los Angeles, California, where he grew up. He was born in 1971 as Mark Cools. He was raised from a young age as a Muslim convert. His father had converted to Islam in prison, apparently on some gang-related charges. He had taken the surname Akbar, and his mother followed suit, eventually changing Mark's name to Hasan Kareem Akbar when he was just a child. By all accounts, young Hasan was very bright. He was an honor student at Locke High School in LA, and he was devout in his faith, praying regularly at a local mosque. He was the first in his family to go to college, and he attended the University of California, Davis in 1988. College, however, was a bit of a struggle. It took Akbar a whopping 9 years to graduate from UC Davis. Eventually, though, in 1997, he did earn dual degrees in aeronautical and mechanical engineering. And while it took him a little bit of time, the types of degrees that he obtained speak to his intellect. You don't just complete engineering majors without, being kind of smart. But socially and emotionally, things were a little bit rockier. Akbar participated in Army ROTC during college, but he didn't complete the program. And then after obtaining his degrees, Akbar apparently had a load of student debt, and so he enlisted in the army in 1998. As a soldier, Akbar's record was just basically average. He was assigned as a combat engineer, basically the guys who handle construction, demolitions, and electrical work, and he eventually rose to the rank of E5, sergeant. But many who served with him sensed that something was off about this guy. Fellow soldiers later testified that Akbar was often late to duties and that he forgot basic tasks while he was on duty. On a field exercise in Louisiana, he was responsible for ensuring everyone brought their gear. But he forgot his very own duffel bag. On another occasion, he misplaced his dog tags. Now, these things might sound so minor, but in the military, they do mark you as kind of unreliable. It's like, come on, man, you're holding everyone up. One sergeant recalled that Akbar could even fall asleep standing up. He literally was caught snoozing during live fire drills. Some chalked it up to Akbar having insomnia, and others said that he had sleeping disorders, which, by the way, his defense will later kind of use this in their claims. Others thought that he was just kind of, out of it. Akbar also exhibited very bizarre behaviors. Soldiers actually nicknamed him the Crouching Tiger. And they did this after an incident where Akbar woke up in the middle of the night and began doing martial arts moves in the dark. He was like slicing the air at imaginary foes. A fellow soldier admitted, quote, "I wondered about Akbar every time I was in the field with him, how vulnerable I might be and what was going through his mind," end quote. Beyond the quirks, Akbar felt increasingly alienated. He was a Black Muslim man in an army that, post 9/11, was gearing up to fight in Muslim countries. According to his family and his attorneys, Akbar endured relentless ridicule about his religion and heritage while he was serving. In the lead up into the Iraq invasion, the atmosphere in the division was charged with anti-Iraqi and anti-Arab sentiment. Soldiers at Camp Pennsylvania, many of whom would soon be fighting Iraqi troops, often used derogatory slurs like raghead and towelhead to refer to the enemy. Those slurs were commonly heard in mess hall chatter and even scribbled as graffiti on latrine walls. Some officers tried to frame it as typical depersonalizing the enemy talk, crude but not aimed specifically at Akbar. An equal opportunity officer in the unit, Sergeant Patricia Lewis, she said that she occasionally had to tell soldiers to knock it off, knock off the anti-Muslim jokes, knowing that any devout Muslim soldier, and there were more, would be extremely offended by such talk. And guess what? Akbar was extremely offended and more. He grew fearful, apparently, and he grew paranoid. At Fort Campbell, before he deployed, Akbar actually told an NCO that he was worried by rumors that he'd heard. You see, one night he called Staff Sergeant Billy Rogers very upset. He asked if it was true that the U.S. was going to rape and plunder Muslim women once they invaded Iraq. Rogers had to tell him that these were wild stories circulating and that they were fake news, just bravado and nonsense among soldiers. He called it soldier talk. But to Akbar, they sounded like confirmation of his worst fears, that he was being asked to partake in something monstrous against people of his own faith. His superiors sensed Akbar was conflicted about fighting Muslims. In fact, some officers debated whether Akbar should deploy to Kuwait at all, precisely because of his religion, and it was evident that they saw this erratic behavior. In one startling account, a platoon sergeant was trying to test Akbar's loyalty by straight up confronting him, but also by using derogatory terms. A sergeant first class pulled Akbar into his office and demanded, quote, "What would you do if you came over a ridge and saw a raghead? Would you kill him?" That phrasing, right, using a slur, must have been jarring to the listener, which was Akbar. Akbar's response was chillingly cryptic. He said, quote, "It would depend on what kind of jihad I was on," end quote. That answer, evasive and referring to holy war, definitely raised eyebrows. It wasn't, of course, yes, Sergeant, I'm going to do my duty. It was more like Akbar indicating his actions might depend on his personal interpretation of faith and mission. Which, I don't know, kind of a red flag. But in the end, despite misgivings and, I don't know, not really trusting the guy, no one removed Akbar from the deployment. He shipped out with the unit to Kuwait. Some, in retrospect, they hoped that maybe he would straighten up in a combat zone. Others just, crossed their fingers that he wouldn't cause any type of trouble. But as we know, inside Akbar's mind, a storm was brewing. Evidence later revealed just how deep Akbar's resentment and radicalization ran. Investigators later found Akbar's diary, and it was a goldmine of red flags. In one entry dated February 23, 2002, which was a full year before the attack, Akbar wrote that he believed if he stayed in the army, it would, quote, eventually lead him to prison, and he admitted, "I already want to kill several of them," end quote. Think about that. A U.S. soldier writing in cold blood that he wants to kill his fellow soldiers long before any shots were fired. The diary detailed his growing anger at the U.S. government, his conversion to a more extreme interpretation of Islam, and a personal sense of persecution. He railed against America and seemed to justify violence. All of this would later come out at his trial, but in March of 2003, no one in his chain of command had read those diary pages. They only saw glimpses of his bitterness. To his mother, Kawan Bilal, and his family, Hasan was troubled by how he was treated. After the attack, his mother would claim that he had told her on the phone, "Mama, when I get over there, I have the feeling they are going to arrest me just because of the name I carry." Which is interesting. It's almost like he knew what he was going to do, and he prepped his mom, like he's basically gaslighting her, right? He prepped his mom saying like, they're probably going to put me in jail, but it's only because of my name, not because of what I intend to do, right? So he was, in his mind, a marked man. He expected discrimination even before he got to where he was going. Family and mosque acquaintances described Hasan as a faithful, quiet person. An imam from one of his mosques actually expressed that if Akbar truly attacked his superiors, something must have driven him over the edge beyond what they taught in their religion. And in essence, those who knew him were quite literally shocked. They never imagined him capable of such carnage. But he was capable. Akbar's actions at Camp Pennsylvania were not a sudden psychotic break in the moment. They were premeditated. He stole those 4 M67 fragmentation grenades from a Humvee hours earlier. He studied the camp's layout and methodically turned off the generator to maximize confusion. And let's not forget, he wasn't working alone. As Command Sergeant Major Womack told us, he sent the other guy back to the tents and said, "Oh, just go to sleep. I got this covered." And in the chaos, he shouted the alarm to feign an outside attack because he wanted people to run out so that he could shoot them. These are not the steps of someone who simply snapped in a moment of rage. This was planned, deliberate mass murder. Whether motivated by twisted ideology, personal grudges, or mental illness, or, I don't know, maybe a cocktail of all three, only Akbar fully knows. What we do know is that by dawn on March 23, 2003, Akbar was in custody and 2 of his comrades were fatally wounded, all because of his plan. In the hours and days following the attack, Army investigators and the chain of command worked swiftly to document the crime. This incident was unprecedented in the new war and extremely rare in the recent U.S. military history. The first fragging incident, actually, since the Vietnam War era to occur in a wartime theater. The Army's Criminal Investigative Division, Army CID, they gathered evidence on site in Kuwait, and they had plenty. Unexploded grenade safety pins, fragments, and the generator fingerprints, and of course, the prime suspect in custody with the fired weapon. Fellow soldiers gave statements recounting what they saw and heard. The official motive remained somewhat elusive. Initially, military spokesmen cautiously suggested a motive. The motive in the attack most likely was resentment. And that was said by Army spokesman Max Blumenfeld. And that was said the day after the attack, right? So we don't know what the motive was, but this was what was stated within 24 hours. So let's think about it. Resentment, a simple word that in this case might encompass many grievances. Resentment of superiors, resentment of perceived mistreatment, resentment of being forced to fight fellow Muslims. The shock rippled back home. News broke in the US that a soldier had been arrested for a deadly grenade attack on his own unit. Families of troops in Kuwait, they were horrified and they were desperate for information. Like they were trying to get a hold of their loved ones. Two American families, meanwhile, received the worst news. They learned that their loved ones had been killed in action, not by enemy fire, but by a fellow American. Captain Seifert's parents in Pennsylvania, they were stunned. He had just spoken to them days earlier. Major Stone's fiancé and children, they had to come to grips with his loss and the cruel manner of how he was lost. The military flew Akbar back to the United States to face justice. Initially, he was confined at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st, and then he was moved to a more secure location. The case was sensitive and it had to be handled carefully. An insider attack could theoretically be considered treason or even terrorism. However, the Army chose to prosecute it as a straightforward murder and attempted murder under military law. They convened a general court-martial for Sergeant Hasan Akbar, and they were seeking the death penalty. It would take 2 full years for the court-martial to begin, and during that time, Akbar was held in a military prison and he underwent mental evaluation. There was speculation about his mental state. Was he insane, or did he know exactly what he was doing? His defense team prepared to argue that he suffered from severe mental illness. Indeed, at trial, they would present evidence that Akbar had long-standing psychiatric problems. Paranoia, check. Depression, check. Insomnia, check. You name it, check, 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 check. But the prosecution had that diary, and they also had a pile of physical evidence. You see, this wouldn't be an easy case for the defense. Interestingly, early on, Akbar's mother, she was like an advocate for her son in this case. She maintained his innocence. She told reporters that she feared her son was accused only because he was a Muslim and that he wouldn't try to take nobody's life. He's not like that, she said. She recounted that Akbar had told her the only thing he was going to do in the war was blow up bridges, because he was an engineer. He never said he was going to hurt anyone directly. But as evidence mounted, even family had to accept that Hasan had indeed done this terrible thing. The question remained was why? And what do we do with this guy now? Let's fast forward to April of 2005. And by the way, there is an incident that happens right before his court-martial, but I'm going to tell you all of that at the end. It's called the Scissor Incident. Okay, but let's fast forward to April 2005. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a general court-martial is assembled for one of the most significant trials of the Iraq War era. Sergeant Hasan Akbar stands trial before a panel of 15 senior officers and non-commissioned officers. The charges are 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted premeditated murder, aligning with the 2 dead and 3 of the 14 wounded. Why they didn't charge all 14 as attempted premeditated murder, I do not know, but I'm assuming that the 3 that were charged as attempted premeditated murder was because they were very close to dying. All right, so this is a capital case, meaning that the death penalty is on the table. Over several weeks, the court-martial panel heard harrowing testimony. Survivors of the attack recounted waking up to fire and shrapnel, hearing a voice shout, "We're under attack," which, by the way, was the perpetrator, and then realizing that it was Akbar who had shouted it. Captain, now Major Terrence Bacon, who was wounded by a grenade shrapnel, testified to basically saying that there was a lot of noise, a lot of screaming, a lot of blood in the command tent, and he painted a picture of the carnage that Akbar caused. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence: Akbar's rifle, ballistics tying its bullets to the wounds of the victims, the generator that he tampered with, and those damning fingerprints. Perhaps, though, most powerful is Akbar's own journal. Those are his personal thoughts. What he thinks will never come to light comes to light at this court martial. Military prosecutors read from his diary entries, his musings about jihad, his anger at the US government, and that chilling line from a year prior about wanting to kill his own comrades. The prosecution argues that this was not an act of sudden passion or self-defense of himself or others or whatever, but a premeditated betrayal fueled by extremist ideology and personal vendetta. In their words, it was one of the most egregious offenses in modern military history: an American soldier drawing first blood on his comrades at the outset of a war. The defense, led by military attorneys, did not try to claim that Akbar was innocent. The evidence was far too overwhelming. Instead, they mounted a mitigation defense, essentially trying to say why Akbar did what he did and why he should be spared the death penalty. They brought up his troubled upbringing. Witnesses described how Akbar and his siblings endured physical and even sexual abuse as children. They outlined his mental health struggles, how he exhibited paranoia and irrational behavior. Hey, let's not forget about him karate chopping air in the middle of the night. They also talk about how he hardly slept for days on end leading up to the attack. An army psychiatrist testified that Akbar had a severe personality disorder. The defense suggested that under the stress of the impending combat against fellow Muslims, Akbar simply snapped. He experienced a psychological breakdown. One of their key points was that he had expressed fear and confusion about the war, as evidenced by his questions about the atrocities and his being teased about his faith. Remember, when he was still back at Fort Campbell, he asked, like, hey, is this really going to happen? And they were kind of like, no, this is all just bravado and all that jazz. But the prosecution countered the defense hard. They highlighted how calculated the act was and how Akbar's own writings showed that he was not insane, but intentional. A major point of contention is motive. Was this terrorism? Was this treason? Or was this simply a personal act of murder? The military never charged Akbar with treason or any terrorism statute, likely because there was no evidence that he was following orders from an enemy. He wasn't part of Al-Qaeda or any foreign group. He was a lone wolf of sorts. He had never even communicated with people online. And remember, it's 2003. It's still the early days of the internet. Kind of early-ish, I guess. In fact, let's talk about this a little bit more. This enemy, right? Was he a lone wolf or was he communicating with the enemy? An army letter later noted that there was no evidence that this attack was inspired by a foreign terrorist organization or that Sergeant Akbar was in communication with an enemy entity at all. So legally, this was handled as murder within the UCMJ, within the military justice system, right? Once all the evidence was presented, the case was given to the jury. They considered the facts and they returned a guilty verdict. And just to be clear, he was convicted of 2 specifications of premeditated murder and 3 specifications of attempted premeditated murder. As we know, if you've been listening to my show, court-martials are quickly followed from verdict to sentencing, and sentencing followed immediately. I've already provided you much of the sentencing evidence above with regards to the matters in aggravation and the matters in mitigation. But during the defense's opportunity to present evidence, Hasan Akbar actually makes an unsworn statement in open court. After weeks of gruesome testimony and after many of the wounded victims testified with visible anger and pain, this was Akbar's one chance to address the panel that would ultimately decide his fate. Akbar spoke quietly, so softly, in fact, that people strained to hear what he was saying. He said, quote, "I want to apologize for the attack that occurred." His voice said, barely above a whisper, quote, "I felt that my life was in jeopardy. and that I had no other options. I also want to ask for forgiveness, end quote. Well, it is an apology of sorts, but also a statement of warped justification. He felt endangered, he claims. I mean, it's not exactly full accountability, but it's all that he offered. Many in the courtroom, especially the victims and families, found the apology hollow and infuriating. How were his life and liberty in jeopardy from the men sleeping next to him? They were about to invade Iraq, yes, but he was not under attack that night until he made himself the attacker first. After brief deliberations, I heard that it was something like 7 hours, the panel of military jurors unanimously sentenced Sergeant Hasan Akbar to death. And that was for the murders of Christopher Seifer and Gregory Stone. Akbar became the first American soldier since the Vietnam War to be convicted of killing fellow soldiers during wartime, which, is an infamous distinction. And he's now one of a very small number of U.S. service members on military death row. When the sentence was announced, Akbar reportedly showed little to no emotion. But elsewhere, there were sighs of relief and tears. Captain Seifert's widow and now toddler had some measure of justice, although it would never bring him back. And Major Stone's family saw his killer finally condemned. Now, I didn't mention this earlier because it had not come up during trial, but let me tell you about the Scissor Attack. Yes, there was a Scissor Attack. So on May 30th, 2005, during a pretrial hearing and 7 days before the start of this trial, Akbar's trial, Akbar had apparently snuck something into his hands while traversing from one location to the next. I did read that he got this from a JAG. I don't know whether it was his defense attorney or from the prosecution. I'm assuming it's his defense, but who knows? Anyway, so he was able to sneak something off of a desk. He was then being escorted by some military police officers, but nonetheless, no one saw him sneak this item, right? When all of a sudden, Akbar told an MP that he needed to use the restroom. So, letting him use the restroom, they removed his restraints, and that's when Akbar, no kidding, attacked the MP with a pair of scissors. And these weren't like baby scissors. They were described in the appellate opinion as 12-inch scissors. Akbar stabbed the MP in the neck, and then he tried to grab the MP's firearm, but thankfully he was subdued by another MP. This incident was not allowed to be discussed during the death penalty court-martial, but it is still crazy to hear that something like this could happen. And holy smokes, my jaw is on the ground. And by the way, I did read in the appellate opinion that the defense did not request like a delay in the start of trial. And it was probably because they didn't want the government to be able to tack on an additional charge. Because that is insane. I mean, you have a guy who committed this crazy grenade attack, and now he's committing another attack right before his trial. I do want to point out that that MP did survive the attack. And to be honest, I'm not sure if they ever brought further charges against Hasan Akbar with regards to that MP attack. So I don't know. I mean, he got the death penalty, and so there he is, but I don't know whether they ever did anything about that specific attack. After the court-martial, Hasan Akbar was transported to the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is the military's maximum security prison, and that is where death row is housed. There, he joined a small group of convicted murderers awaiting a fate that, in truth, might never be carried out. In the U.S. military justice system, a death sentence triggers an automatic lengthy appeals process, and Akbar's case was no exception. Over the next decade, his case wound its way through appellate courts. In July of 2012, the Army Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction and the sentence. Akbar's defense team appealed even further, raising numerous issues. They argued that his original attorneys were ineffective. They claimed that the trial court didn't fully explore his mental health history, his attorneys didn't, For example, they claim that the abuse he suffered as a child, which might have swayed the jury to spare his life, wasn't drawn out for the members. In the appeal, the appellate defense also pointed out irregularities, such as the fact that one juror who allegedly said, quote, someone like Akbar should be shot and killed, end quote. He said this before the trial, and that juror was not excused, which of course is a sign of possible bias. The appeals went through the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, CAF, which is the military's highest court, by the way. And in August of 2015, CAF upheld Akbar's death sentence. Finally, Akbar petitioned the Supreme Court, and in 2016, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, letting the conviction and sentence stand. With that, Hasan Akbar had exhausted his direct appeals. As of today, 22 years after the attack, he remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth, identified as inmate Hasan K. Akbar, prisoner number, maybe just a sequence, but known to all as the grenade attacker. He's now in his mid-50s and he spends 23 hours a day in a cell. Only the President of the United States can approve the execution of a military prisoner. And so far, no president has done so in Akbar's case. In fact, no U.S. service member has been executed in over 6 decades. Akbar is one of only 4 remaining on military's death row. Others include the Fort Hood shooter Nidal Hasan and 2 older cases of rape and murder from the 1980s. And I've covered 3 of the 4 cases so far. Their executions are not imminent, so Akbar continues to live out his days in confinement. In the years since 2003, the Camp Pennsylvania attack has left a legacy of grief, lessons, and, lingering controversy. The Army initially was reluctant to draw too much attention to this incident, which, of course, they thought could damage morale and public support. Eventually, though, they did recognize its broader implications. This was an insider attack before that term became sadly familiar in later years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And if you're familiar with those insider attacks, that's where trainees would turn on U.S. advisors occasionally. This case has forced commanders to think about screening troops for extreme views or mental instability, especially if they have already expressed some sort of sympathy with enemy ideology. The balance between unit cohesion and respecting diversity of religion also came into sharp focus in this case. Akbar's case showed how a toxic environment of bigotry can sometimes contribute to disaster, although we don't know whether he was going to commit these acts, whether there was bigotry or not, really. Fellow soldiers did testify how common anti-Muslim slurs were in this specific unit, something that leadership perhaps should have clamped down on. While nothing actually excuses Akbar's actions, understanding the climate that he was in has been important for the Army in potentially preventing future incidents. For the survivors and families, the pain never fully fades. Major Greg Stone, for instance, clung to life for 2 days after the attack. He died on March 25, 2003, in a Kuwait hospital. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in April of 2003. His fiancée Tammy and his sons had to go on without him, always wondering why. Why him? Captain Chris Seifert was brought home to Pennsylvania. He was buried in his hometown, survived by his wife Teresa and their infant son. Teresa Seifert, now a young widow, had to navigate life as a single mom, forever missing her husband who was killed by someone who should have had his back. In Seifert's honor, the Army later added his name to the Military Intelligence Memorial Hall at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and they even named the Fort Huachuca School-Age Center after him. Among the 14 survivors and those who were wounded, most eventually recovered, though some had lifelong scars. Colonel, later General Hodges, carried shrapnel in his arm, but went on to continue a distinguished career. Command Sergeant Major Bart Womack, who we all heard from, he miraculously survived multiple grenades being lodged into his tent, and he had to cope with the emotional trauma. Womack said, quote, "God wanted me here to tell the story," end quote. And guess what? He has told that story. He authored a book titled Embedded Enemy, The Insider Threat, detailing that very night. Command Sergeant Major Womack to this day says that he lives it every day and that writing about him became a form of therapy. I mean, you can still hear the haunted tone in his voice as he relives those seconds when the grenade rolled in and changed everything. Womack and the other victims have fought throughout the years to get the victims of the 2003 Camp Pennsylvania attack the Purple Heart. However, they have been told that the victims do not qualify. The Purple Heart is a medal given to those wounded or killed by enemy action, and Congress has said that Akbar does not qualify as an enemy. Now, some of you might recall the 2009 Fort Hood massacre committed by another guy named Hasan Akbar. I will cover that case one day in the future. But listen, the victims of that attack were also initially denied the Purple Heart. However, since that attack occurred, Congress actually broadened the criteria for Purple Heart recipients to include attacks inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. With that broadening of the description, the 2009 Fort Hood victims did eventually receive the Purple Heart. However, the 2003 Camp Pennsylvania victims still did not qualify, since Akbar had never formally been in communications with a foreign terrorist organization. That being said, Command Sergeant Major Womack and other victims keep fighting to change this. As we wrap up, let's remember Captain Christopher Seifer and Major Gregory Stone, their lives of service and the sacrifice that they never expected to make. And let's reflect on the lessons of Camp Pennsylvania. In the words of Command Sergeant Major Womack, who survived that night by a mix of luck and providence, quote, "If it happened inside the close-knit brotherhood of the armed forces, then it could happen anywhere in any organization, campus, or community," end quote. Vigilance, understanding, and unity are our best defense against the kind of hatred and resentment that led to this tragedy. Now, before I end, let me circle back to the British fighter jet that was shot down in Kuwait. On February 23rd, 2003, just like an hour and a half after the first grenade was launched, a British Tornado fighter jet was tragically shot down by a U.S. Patriot missile near Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait, killing both crew members. Those crew members were Flight Lieutenants Kevin Main and David Williams. A post-accident investigation into that accident revealed that the aircraft's friend or foe signal wasn't working properly, and that the automated Patriot system mistook the jet for an incoming missile. With little time for human intervention in this case, the system launched a fatal strike. Investigators found that poor coordination between coalition forces and over-reliance on automation and a failure to manage shared airspace all contributed to this deadly mistake. The case exposed serious flaws in how Allied technology and communication were handled during the early days of the Iraq War. All right, True Crime Army, thank you so much for sticking with me throughout the last few weeks as I covered Camp Pennsylvania. You might actually recall me mentioning this case back in the day when I covered the Esposito Allen case from Fob Danger. And actually, I remember I did a 2-part episode on this case on my TikTok back in, I believe it was the summer of 22. All right, this case is one where the perpetrator is one of 4 guys on military death row. And now I have officially covered 3 of the 4 death row cases. There is only one case for me to cover next, and that is Nidal Hasan. And I will get to it, but it is going to take time. If you're interested in listening to more cases, however, in the meantime that I have in the vault, join my Patreon at patreon.com/militarymurder, where for as little as $5, you can access over 50 full-length episodes right now. So if you're getting ready to PCS and you're road tripping, make sure you sign up for Patreon because you can have every single episode that I've ever covered, plus 50 more completely ad-free. My sources for this episode include various appellate court opinions, The book Embedded Enemy by Bart Womack and various articles which covered this case right when it was happening. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Ty-Ops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next time.
Mama's working on her podcast.
I don't want to.